and welcome to the Fairy Whispering Podcast. I'm your host, Claire Silverwand. In the Northern Hemisphere, we are now in the lead up to summer solstice on Thursday, the 20th of June, and the worldwide celebration of International Fairy Day on the 24th of June. According to fairy tradition, this is a potent time to see fairies. To celebrate this month, I have some wonderful fairy-themed episodes for my listeners. To keep up with the podcast, you can follow on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube at Fairy Whispering Podcast. On my YouTube channel, you can watch videos of podcast chats and videos about fairies. This is an independent podcast produced entirely by me, so please support via my Buy Me a Coffee page, and please share this episode with a friend. Thank you. For this episode, I met with social historian Dr. Kevin Dixon in the cloisters of the very haunted Tor Abbey in Torquay, Devon. Kevin shared some of the occult history of the town, which was recently named the most haunted in England. We also talk about pixies, cunning folk, and more. As I said, we were sat in the Abbey cloisters, and you will hear noises of visitors who are milling around in the background. There is also some noise from construction workers as the Abbey is currently being renovated. However, I cannot explain the 3 knocks that seem to emanate from the table we were sitting at for our chat. It was very fitting that Kevin had been talking about the spiritualist movement and seances. Listen out for the knocks. Perhaps a spirit trying to join our conversation? My thanks to Kevin for the fascinating information he shared. Be warned, there is a section where Kevin shares some shocking information about the belief in changelings, which some listeners may find disturbing. Thank you for listening. Enjoy this episode. The Fairy Whispering Podcast explores guests' encounters with the other world of fairy and ways of connecting with this realm. From listening to messages in owls' hoots, finding a 4-leaf clover, chasing rainbows, or inviting a gnome to dinner. I'm Claire Silverwand, a fairy whisperer, researcher, and your guide on this journey. Take my hand and step into the twilit woodland, where they are waiting to meet you. I met Kevin at Tor Abbey and we're sat down in the cloisters. It's got a lovely echoey feel to it, hasn't it? And display cases.
There's a gravestone over there.
Sort of a stone.
A knight, yeah, that's another
knight.
Grave effigy, and lots of bits of masonry from 1196 onwards.
Yeah.
This place was built.
So it's an ideal place to be talking about ghosts and
It is,
and history.
and Tor Abbey's full of ghosts.
Yeah.
Full of ghost stories.
What got you into this? Into your interest in history of
Yep.
Torquay and your writing? How did you?
Right. Okay.
How did
Claire.
that start?
Right. I got into this whole thing really because let's see, I didn't do very well at school. You know, and I did a thing in my day, because I'm 64 now, I did a thing called O-level history, or GCSE, or whatever it was called then, and I didn't really like it. It's only later I really got interested in history, and what I think is real history. And real history is about, where we are, who we are, what we believe, and, where we're going. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it is. And it's being able to walk down your own street, whether it's an old Tudor street or something like that, or whether it's something that's really sort of modern. and then you can actually sort of see something, and you can figure out, that's where your parents used to go to the pub, or your grandparents used to work, or that's what they used to eat, and that's the real history. And then I started getting involved in conversations in pubs and clubs, and people would come out with some of this stuff that you'd see about the sort of legends and the local stories, and particularly things like ghost stories, and that's what really fascinates people.
Yes, it does.
It does.
Captures our imagination.
It does, yeah, and people really like that.
Yeah.
And some of the legends, and people say, is that true? Did Napoleon have a baby in Torquay? No, but this is where those kind of stories might come from.
Yes.
I wrote an article on the hairy hands about how that links up with some of the other ghost stuff.
Right.
And how ghosts changed in their nature during the First World War.
Yeah,
and
I'm
that's where
interested in that.
Yeah, and I think the hairy hands fits into that quite nicely.
Yes.
And it also fits into some of the movie stuff, the sort of movie history and media history about how the movies actually create some of our mythology, which is something we can talk about if you like. But
yeah, could you talk a little bit about that around the hairy hands and what you've just said about the First World War?
Yep.
And how that changed our psychology, I suppose, or how we saw things.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the hairy hands incident. I think it's about 1923, 1924, something like that.
1921.
1921. Yeah. So it's that very, very early 1920 stuff. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that happened there, and this happened right across the country. But if we look at Torquay, if we go along Torquay seafront, you've got the War Memorial.
Yeah.
There's 602 names there. So absolutely every family in Torquay lost somebody in the First World War. So that moves into something people have actually called the morbid age. So you go into every home, and there'll be one of these round brass plaques, saying lost in action. So every factory, every home, every office would probably have a little memorial. And then you had these huge memorials, these great memorials all over the place. And so you're talking about the morbid age. Society, I think, then kind of split. Anybody that was born after 1900 that didn't go through that war, they were coming to age, they were coming into their early 20s. And then you had the Great Jazz Age, and if you look at how people dressed, I've just been looking at some photographs this morning, some images this morning of people on the beach in Torquay in 1911, full-length dresses, the whole Agatha Christie thing, the big fur hats.
Oh,
you might see their ankles, and they were selling, women's bathing. It's International Women's Day today. They were showing, what women should wear on the beach, and it was long dresses. It was down past the knee. Big long dresses and thick woolly socks. How you swam in those, I've no idea.
Yeah.
10 years later, that was 1911. So 1921. People took all their clothes off, and you see them on the beach. The legs are bare, the shoulders are bare, shorter hair. So that's one thing. That was the sort of the jazz age, the movies, all that excitement. The other side was what they call the morbid age, which was a real interest in the occult, in the supernatural. That was the second explosion of spiritualism in Torquay. So every night of the week you could probably go off and see a spiritualist, and do a seance. Yeah. So there's real interest in the afterlife and contact in the afterlife. So that shifted. The nature of the supernatural shifted as well. Traditionally, through the 18th and 19th centuries, during the 18th and mostly the 19th centuries, ghosts were somebody you'd know. They were a relative or a friend, and they were coming back and they were telling you things like, this is where my will is, and this is where I died of somebody killed me or something like that. I want help. So it's that kind of benign ghost. Then during the sort of First World, it started to change a little bit, but really during the First World War, you started getting the malevolent ghost. You started getting the nasty ghost. And the big example we've got is the most haunted house in England was in Torquay.
Yes.
And it's called Castellamare. Yeah. And it had been known as a haunted house for about 50 years.
Right.
It's been converted into apartments now, and I know people that lived there, so there's nothing they've told me. But it was known for about 50 years as being a derelict, being a haunted house. It was the usual haunted house stuff, the shrieking and the doors not being locked, footsteps, all of that, but nothing really nasty, that kind of thing. Again, that kind of changed. In 1917, there was a real investigation, by a lady called Violet Tweedale.
Yes, I've heard of her in
Yep.
relation to pixie sighting she had.
Yes, in Lupton.
Yes.
We'll talk about pixies in a
Yeah,
bit, because
yeah.
the pixies are fascinating.
Yeah.
So she was lived in Torquay. She was a very well-known psychic. She was involved in the court case against the Daily Mail a few years later about whether psychics were real or not, and so in 1917 she took a 10-15 strong team in to do a real investigation. They put not traps, but they just make sure that they weren't being defrauded. So they put flour down and things on doors to so people weren't coming in during the night and messing around with things. Yeah. And then they brought in a psychic, and they brought some soldiers in on leave. And the psychic was apparently possessed. And she threw one of the soldiers against the wall with huge strength, and then they did another one, and there was another séance and another possession of this woman. And they went back and they thought that the psychic said it was a doctor that went mad, something like that, killed one of his patients, then so it's the usual angry, violent Amityville horror type of ghost. And then another guy, Lord St Audrey's, went in 1921, I think. And the same thing. They went round with candlelight, and one of them was possessed and thrown through the door, and all of that really dramatic stuff. Now, suddenly you get the angry, malevolent poltergeist that you don't know.
Yeah.
And one of the suggestions is a bit like the hairy hands. The First World War traumatised people so much that they two views on this. Either it makes people more willing to, and more angry and depressed, and so they're more likely to believe in things, an angry ghost, because it was an angry, violent time, millions dead, of course, or it opens up something else, but that's up to your listeners to decide. And the second thing with the hairy hands is if we always look back at what's on in the movies, in the books, in the televisions, because that always reflects and influences what people do. So, for example, I've just done something on Berry Pomeroy, and all of those Berry Pomeroy ghosts come out of that Gothic tradition.
Right.
So you can actually look at them. You can read the books like the Castle of Otranto and the Adolfo books and things, and you can see it's reflected in the mythology that grew up around Berry Pomeroy. Now, nobody's saying in Berry Pomeroy that people don't see weird stuff, because I've interviewed dozens and dozens of people that have, but it's not necessarily to do with the Matilda and being walled up in cellars and all of that kind of thing, which is again a sort of Gothic trope, all from the books.
That's being created around it.
People see things they don't understand, and then they build a story around them. And there's a bit of a tourism thing going on there as well, particularly in Torquay, because the carriages just lined up along Torquay Strand, and they used to say, "Would you like a tour of the haunted castle?" And on the way up, they tell stories, and they're embroidered stories. So always look at, I call them revenant rules. Always look at where. Always look at who makes money out of this.
Yes.
Do they have an incentive, to embroider stories? Do they import stories from other places? Always look at that. What's going on in the movies? What's going on in the books? What's going on in the television? And going back to the hairy hands, the hairy hands thing came up. There was a movie called The Hands of Orlac, where somebody had his hands cut off and went round.
Oh.
Remember that?
Yeah, when was that?
1920s, just about the same time.
About the same time?
About the same time.
Okay.
So and then there was all this trauma at the time about grafting hands on and all of that kind of stuff onto people. So maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, and the spirit hands.
That's it. All of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you can mix up that. Now that's not saying that there's not a core of it. Now, and I always, because I was saying earlier, I lecture a bit on ghosts, and I do ghost walks, and we're sitting in the cloisters, the undercroft of Tor Abbey, amazing medieval building. But I think one of the rules is, what I call the revenant rules, as I said, is that the more a ghost incident has a backstory, the more likely it's not to be true.
Right.
So, so the more if somebody comes to me, as they do in my lectures, and whenever I do a lecture, about a third of my audience have seen a ghost or had a ghostly experience. And we're in Torquay, and more people have seen a ghost in Torquay than anywhere else in Britain. They did a sort of survey recently. So if somebody comes up to me and said, I was at home and I saw the visitation, I saw something, and they describe it, I'll absolutely fully believe them. If somebody comes up to me and said, oh, this is where the Lord of Paynton murdered his wife and bricked her up in the cellar or fathered a baby, and I can say that's probably the Georgians or the Victorians made it up.
Spinning.
Spinning and making it interesting, because it's, people say to me, can you tell me a ghost story of Torquay? And as I said, over the years I've heard hundreds, literally hundreds, Claire, of ghost stories and incidents, and but a lot of them just aren't interesting.
Which ones spark your interest, and do you feel have some substance to them?
Okay, again, it's back to the rules.
Yeah.
It sounds cruel's the wrong word, but I'm a social scientist. I did my academic-y stuff and did my PhD and everything. So the things I always look for is if I always ask somebody, when did you see something? And a lot of people say, oh, I was just about going to sleep, or I was just about waking up. There's your your sleep thing. And we all do that, that in-between time. Yeah. The night hag, they used to call it, they sat on your chest and paralysed you. So, and that's a medical thing, we know that. I always ask people whether they're on any kind of medication. My mum is 93, I just left her this morning. She sees people all the time, because it's Parkinson's medication.
Right.
Or, dementia, all of those kind of things. So it's like an onion, you peel away the obvious stuff.
Yeah.
And then you get to the stuff that I can't explain. So about 5% of the stories I'm baffled. And the big one is there more than one witness at the same time?
Yes.
And I think that's the big one. And then you get things into like time slip ghosts, which are absolutely fast. Tor Abbey, Berry Pomeroy.
Oh right.
They had one there. That's worth looking up. There's a lady I know called Christine who's writing a book on Tor Abbey at the moment, and this is one that I'm really interested in. If I can remember it rightly, 1960s, two ladies in a car. This wasn't at the castle itself.
Yes, I know this one. Yeah.
No, this one. I'm getting this one because it's fascinating. So two ladies in a car drove down this back lane into the old mill. They drove into the old mill, stopped there, and they said that the roofs of the houses were derelict, fallen in. There was a well there, and 2 or 3 hostile-looking children dressed in rags. And they thought, oh, they don't like us round here. We're probably trespassing. So they drove round, went back the next day. Roofs had been repaired. No well, no children. And that kind of time slip goes. So more than one witness.
Yeah.
And I spoke to another lady, came up to me after one of my talks and said that she was at, I think they're called Grimes Graves in Norfolk, and that was an old Bronze Age mines. He used to dig flint out or something like that. And they were sitting, so they went round, and she was sitting on the grass, looking down, having a sandwich, and she saw 2 or 3 miners digging.
Oh.
And she looked across, and there's a gentleman next to her, and said, "Can you see them as well?" She goes, "Yes," and then disappeared.
There's loads of that type
time
of
slip
case.
stuff.
Time slip. That fascinates me as well. I did a talk for an online group a few months ago about vanishing cottages.
Yes, time slip stuff. Yeah.
2 of those on Dartmoor and
There's
one near me. Judy Chard.
Oh yes, another.
She used to live in the back of where I live, and some friends of hers saw a cottage.
Yes,
up there. Yeah.
And that kind of thing really sort of reflects, some of those kind of stories. So that was one of the things I would say. So more than one witness. The brief seeing things when somebody's young, healthy, middle of the day. And they haven't just woken up. So those are the kind of things. Grief, I always ask people whether you have just had some kind of a bereavement recently, because sometimes that affects how people see things. But all of the psychological stuff, the pareidolia, when you see pictures, and there's so many photographs you can actually reinterpret. Yeah. But the certain buildings and certain places do seem to have repeated sightings of different things, and I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
And you can date the ghost how what it looks like, what it does, who it is, what it's trying to impart, whether it's got a reason. A lot of them are morality tales. A lot of them are particular warnings. A lot of them are linked up, as we're sitting in a sort of medieval abbey now, a lot of them are linked up with the old ideas of purgatory.
Yeah.
And you've got to look at the history of the kind of suppression of ghost ideas. Because the Anglican Church, when it took over from Catholicism, then it tried to suppress the whole idea of purgatory.
Right.
So the whole idea of purgatory, which is what built this place, really.
Yeah.
That's why abbeys were the richest landowners in the country. Because the whole idea was that when you died, you'd go into sort of a hellish place and fire with purgatory. And you could actually buy time back if you got somebody to pray for you.
Yeah.
So there was this whole time when the theory is that if you're in purgatory, you could go up to heaven or down to hell, or you might pop back to say, look, I've made a mistake, or let's sort out some problems. When the Reformation came and strict Calvinism said, no, you were judged, you died, you were judged, you went to heaven or hell. So they tried to suppress, the Anglican Church really tried to suppress the supernatural, but they couldn't do it because people kept seeing stuff.
Yeah.
And they kept experiencing it. And then it really became a bit more popular when the Wesleys, the father of Methodism, they had a poltergeist.
Oh.
So, and he wrote a book about that they're having a
I'm
poltergeist.
interested in that because my great grandfather was a Methodist minister.
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
And it was all like fire and brimstone stuff. So yeah, could you tell me a bit about that? I haven't heard about that book.
Yes, it was early in their sort of careers. They wrote this book about when they were children. They had a poltergeist. So it really then people started treating things a bit more seriously. The later effects, then we had the sort of the Gothic tradition, and then you had Romanticism, about a reaction and a rejection of industrial Britain and rationalism and science and all of that. And then later you started getting things like spiritualism. And interestingly, in Torquay, if you look at the whole thing, very, very, as we said, it's International Women's Day. Yeah. The number of women that were actually involved in the occult, and Torquay was a centre of the occult in the 19th century, right the way through the early 20th century, and there were very few respectable jobs an independent woman could do in Victorian Torquay, and one of them was to be a medium, spiritualist medium, and earn money, gain respect, and of course they couldn't join the Anglican Church, certainly couldn't join the Catholic Church, and become some of the smaller Christian sects where they could be, but it was an alternative religion, and if you look at the overlap between spiritualists, female spiritualists and the suffragettes, and the other radical movements such as vegetarianism, animal rights, animal welfare, even nudism, things like that, then you've got that entire different political and tradition that was actually going on.
So how does Agatha Christie fit in with all of this then? Because we sort of mentioned her at the beginning, and you said about this new book coming out about her connection with the occult. What can you tell
I just think she used a number of those motifs. I mean, Agatha was exposed to all of that kind of 20th century milieu of the occult and an interest in pseudoscience, and she uses a lot, things like Ouija boards and seances, and there's a movie come out actually set in Venice, which is set around all of that kind of occult stuff. It's just come out in the last few months. Kenneth Branagh, I think, isn't it? Usually is. Usually is.
Yeah. He plays Poirot, doesn't he? But I've not seen that one. The other ones.
Other things in that. Although the new one, I think in Agatha's book, I think she was set somewhere like Cleethorpes or something wet and windy in Britain. And they transferred it to Venice because Venice is much creepier, isn't it? And lots of masks and mist going over the canals. But fascinating stuff, and it's really peeling away these levels, and it gives the occult and ghost stories give people power and influence, around, away from the people that do have power and the influence. Yeah. So it's a bit like saying I know something you don't. Yes. And it's I've got stories and I've got an inner way. So it links up with conspiracy theories, but people still see things, Claire. And,
Yeah.
You know, and as I said, I give a talk, and easiest talk I give, ghost stories of Torbay. You know, I could actually sit there and I could just say, well, I'm going to give you a talk. Right, put your hands up, give me a story, and a third of the audience do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all the women always, it's fascinating, really. The women always put their hand up and say, "I've got one."
Yeah.
The men never do, but they come up to me afterwards.
Yes.
And they say, "Oh, I'm not interested. You know, this is all rubbish." But
I find that even, you know, with my podcast, I have more women that are more willing to openly speak about their, in general, about their experience. And then, you know, men do come to me, but it seems to be, like you say, women seem to be more forthcoming.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Never used to be that way. I mean, if you look at the history of Torquay, right from the very beginning, there was real interest, you know, in occult societies. I mean, from 1810, I mean, there was nobody lived in Torquay. There's about 1,000 people lived in Torquay. But the the Freemasons started, then the Oddfellows, and all of those alternative. Now they're pretty much philanthropical organisations these days. But in those days, they were really interested in alternative thought, and it really worried the church.
Yes.
You know, these people were doing rituals and they were doing all of this kind of secret stuff. And partly that was because they were friendly societies and they had to. But there was a real interest in alternative thought of the Rosicrucians. If you look at some of their old books and things like that, and all linked up and fascinating stuff. And then during the 19th century in Torquay, nearly every occult writer and alternative writer came and lived here, and either stayed here or you're right. That lady just went past. It's worth keeping. That was a leading member of the local pagans.
Oh.
So Ronnie, lovely lady. So isn't that coincidence?
Interesting to talk to you about.
Might be worth a chat actually.
Yeah.
She'd love to chat to you. And I've given talks to the pagans and the Theosophists.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
So it's through the 19th century they had this real interest in the romantic, romanticism, in the sort of Gothic tradition, places like this, the alternative, and it was almost like a paranormal playground, and people exploring new ideas, and so it's that kind of thing.
What was the draw?
Here.
Torquay?
Well, let's see. Torquay didn't really exist in 1800. There was 820 people lived here, and then gradually, as Torquay became a health resort. Well, let's go back a little bit. So the reason Torquay was here, as it was a couple of tiny little fishing villages. The English aristocracy used to have their European tours, the grand tour going to Italy and France. And they used to spend like 3 to 6 months or a year or over there, supposedly learning Greek and Latin, but mainly visiting prostitutes and getting very drunk. And taking opium. The Byrons and all of that kind of stuff. Then Napoleon came to power, so we couldn't leave Britain. So they consciously looked around for somewhere that reminded them of the south of France and Italy, and they chose Torquay.
Hence the Riviera.
English Riviera, and so initially it was there, and then it became a health resort. So we used to send people down here to recover from illnesses. A lot of them didn't, because the big illnesses was of tuberculosis or consumption. So many of the hotels, during the winter, they'd be filled up with people with consumption. And they've got some quotes, that Torquay was full of people coughing and spittoons and horrible stuff like that, and the toll of the funeral bell. And so we were built on death, effectively. The thing is that they didn't realise that consumption was infectious. They thought it was hereditary.
Oh.
Up to about the 1860s, 1870s. So we actually advertised, if you've got tuberculosis, come to Torquay.
Sorry.
So you'd suck in huge numbers of very rich, very sick people, and the cemetery's full of them. And that feeds into that kind of Gothic tradition of death and a fascination with death. Yeah. And then you had people like the Shelleys writing poems about graveyards, and so that was the first tranche, really. It's a town built on death, really.
Okay.
And that whole Victorian cult of death.
Yes.
The second massive wave of tourists that came was 1848. They built the railways, so and suddenly, instead of people having to take carriages and come by sea, that came by rail. Thousands came by rail. And it terrified Torquay because we saw ourselves as being special. And then suddenly you started getting lower middle class and then working class tourists turning up in their thousands. So we consciously diverted them to Paynton. And it's still there today. Because we're in Torquay at the moment. Why isn't there a children's play park on Torquay seafront? We don't like them. There's one in Paynton.
Yeah.
Why don't we have a pier? Torquay doesn't have a pier. We've got a harbour wall.
Yes.
But if you think about Brighton and Blackpool and Paynton and Teignmouth, they've got those great big working class piers.
Okay, so it's kind of like a snobbery.
Yeah, very much so. They called us, Dickens said we were snobs. Ruskin said we were snobs. So we set ourselves up as the premier tourist resort of Britain. And there's even a word that says in the in the papers in the 1920s, we do not want Torquay becoming Brightonised. So no funny hats, and the police really controlled things. You don't want anything to attract the wrong type of tourist.
Yeah.
We had a vote about having a pier in the 1880s and turned it down because it would attract the wrong type of person.
Oh, God.
Even a bandstand, we said, no, we don't want a bandstand, that the wrong type will turn up. And we pretty much suppressed entertainment at weekends because we didn't want day trippers.
Right.
And they diverted people over to Paynton and Teignmouth. Consciously, because it was cheaper, cheaper holidays over there. You put the word out, you could get away with things in Paynton, even things like naughty postcards. You could sell them in Paynton, you couldn't sell them in Torquay. Donkey rides, you don't want them over here. So it's because that. Yeah. So you stratified it. Other things that made of interest is that you had. So by 1900, we were saying we were the richest town in England. So you had the richest woman in England, Baroness Coutts, not very far from here, the richest man in England, in Britain. So, and it became, you could see more members of European royal families in Torquay than anywhere else in the world. So they all sort of came in, but it was rigidly controlled, very sort of class conscious. Yeah. So that meant a couple of things.
Yes.
You had a very, very large numbers of very wealthy, very well-educated people here for 6 months, looking for things to do. And the occult became entertainment. So that was one thing. You also didn't have in my view, you didn't have an alternative political tradition. So you didn't have working class organisations. So the kind of people that would get involved in politics couldn't or wouldn't because they'd lose their jobs or they'd lose their accommodation, or the police were pretty brutal. So a lot of them, I think that nobody would have got into politics, got involved in other things. And there's that overlap between women's rights and expression into things like seances and pseudoscience. Yeah. So lots of people that got involved in things, exploring things like telepathy and mesmerism and all of that was setting up. So it was a real cauldron of alternative ideas.
That's amazing. And then there's the geology.
Let's talk about geology. I think that's fascinating, yes.
Yeah, the good old... that fascinates me, the Stickle Path
fault. Yeah, not very far from here.
I didn't realise until I read your article that it comes out on Rock Walk.
It does,
good old
it
Rock
does.
Walk. And goes all the way across Dartmoor where there's loads of paranormal stories.
Yep.
So... yeah.
Oh, right, yes, it's a geological fault, right the way through Devon, as you say, Claire. And I was reading about this, and I didn't think it terribly seriously. Then, when I started doing my talks, and I said, tell me a supernatural story. And then people were saying, give me an example of some really, really wacky stuff. Yeah. I live in a house, and upstairs I saw a horse. Yeah. I said, okay, that's interesting. Where do you live? Warren Road. And I said, so what's upstairs? And they said, upstairs it leads on. So that's where the stables were. Yeah. Isn't that fascinating? So they'd live downstairs, but the stables were upstairs because of if you know Torquay, it says it's built on 7 hills, it's not. But it's really steep limestone.
Yes.
So you're built on different levels. So one of the suggestions is, right, and I don't know how far to take this, but when I sort of talk to people about seeing odd things, it seems to follow some kind of a bit of a channel right the way through Torquay. Yes. And I think you can do that through Dartmoor as well. So a couple of suggestions is that some people are saying that limestone somehow affects people's perception. That's one thing. Other people are saying that the mind is opened up either scientifically or, but we haven't figured it out yet, because of geological movement.
Yeah.
So the Sticklepath Fault, you can't. There was a little bit of an earthquakey thing, earth tremor back in the 50s that we measured. So that's another possibility. The more scientific suggestion is, and I wrote something on this, is that a lot of those houses in Torquay are built on limestone. Limestone doesn't absorb water, so a lot of those properties are damp.
Okay.
We know that black mould makes people hallucinate. We know that if you live in cold, damp houses, you have your paraffin heaters on and your coal fires on and you don't open the windows, and we know that carbon monoxide makes people see things.
Okay.
So it's back to this onion of peeling layer after layer until you get to the truth in the beginning. But I'd say, the stuff that we don't understand. Yeah, the stuff that we don't really get. So the whole geology, I think, is really interesting. Torquay, seaside resorts being liminal places, between one reality and another reality.
Yes, and that's something else I was going to ask you about, actually, or talk with you about, is liminal places.
Yes.
Because I didn't realise there's an island out there.
Oh, yes, yeah. Hardbreck Rock.
Hardbreck Rock. Wow. And that was part of a desert and had a forest around it once there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how far back you go. But from where we are at the moment in Torquay, you could walk to France. We're talking about 8 to 10,000 years ago. So, because we were connected to the whole of Europe. Right. So at low tide or at storms, you can still go out in the bay in certain places. You can still see logs sticking out of the ground because it was forest right the way through. And you had, and this is where we get into it, really, I love all this stuff. Yeah. So the ice caps melted and the sea level rose, and sometimes like a centimetre a year. So a sort of Mesolithic hunter that had this sort of great playground, open access to fields and forests and wild game. We lost that kind of Eden. And somebody in their lifetime would have seen the waters raise. And you've got Doggerland in the North Sea, and we're finding, whole communities down there, and so people were either forced to go into France or they came into England, and then we cut ourselves off from the continent. Then you come back into whole ideas about species memory, about a lot of our mythology. A lot of the scientific folks, these are just made up stories, but other theorists think that, well, is there some kind of a species memory about types of people that we've lost? Yeah. And that's where you get ideas about fairies, pixies. Yes. Were they real, or are real memories or expressions of things that have happened in the past? I think there possibly might be. And let's see, because I know you're interested in the sort of fairy pixie thing. Yeah. Let's see, fairies and pixies are two different species. Historically, they've been seen, all this. Yeah. So pixies are Celtic, Dumnonian Celtic, and fairies are Anglo-Saxon, and you can see that. And this, just on the border between, I think, Somerset and Devon, there's a couple of villages there that have got legends about fairies and pixies being at war. Yeah. And the Victorians have got a lovely old Victorian picture of the fairy army attacking the pixie army and vice versa. One of the suggestions about that, first of all, it might be some kind of a memory of smaller, darker people that lived in the forests. So you have, and that could be anything from the Beaker people coming in to, taking over that sort of Neolithic Bronze Age. So, and we keep finding DNA stuff now about different types of people, and they would look different. Yeah. So, the blonder, taller people coming in and darker people, that's one possibility. Then a little bit later, you could be talking about the Anglo-Saxons coming into the Celts. Yeah. And that's where because pixies are Celtic, obviously, and they were physically different. Sort of Northern European Germanic people compared to sort of Celtic, darker, shorter people. That's another possibility. So you've got all of that. So is it some kind of a memory? And if you look at fairy lore about the kings and queens of the fairyland, which you don't get in pixie tradition. Yeah. So Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, rather than that kind of sort of tribal society in the southwest. Yes. And the whole idea was that, and this for centuries, we've got all the old books, that the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons moved in, And it took them another couple of hundred years to push all the Celts into Cornwall. Some of them went over to Brittany, which is where you get Brittany from, and then they killed everybody locally. Now DNA came out fairly recently to saying that there's still a different genetic group in Devon as well as Cornwall.
Right.
They've got all these maps.
Yeah.
So they didn't. They sort of came in.
Yeah.
So the Anglo-Saxon came in, took over the territory, but they were this sort of aristocracy.
Okay.
And you still had the sort of that Celtic Domnonians, the old Romano-British underneath. So it wasn't just. So it was Devon as well as Cornwall. And I'll send you the stuff on this.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating stuff.
It is
and
fascinating.
did we keep? And that's why we kept that memory of pixies rather than fairies. So two different species. And there's loads of sort of fairy pixie lore around. Still into Kent's Cavern. The legend was that it was infested by pixies who would rip the fur off dogs, and don't go in there because the tunnels went as far as Kent. Kent's Cavern is not, but there you go. Yeah. As you said, that people spotting supernatural figures, lots of that kind of stuff going on. And you still go to Cockington and still buy a little pixie.
Can you still buy pixies at Cockington then?
I think so. I think I saw some little. I mean, they used to have the forge there, but I haven't been there for ages. But still have the forge, but if you go on, there's still loads and loads of sort of pixie stuff. I got a postcard the other day, an old one, the pixie on the front. That good luck.
I collect the Dartmoor and Devon pixies, the brass ones.
Yeah.
They're becoming more and more rare to find.
They are. Yeah.
I found some at Totnes Market just by sheer luck a couple of years ago. Just bought the lot.
So there's still a lot of these things. We talked about hagstones on the beach.
Yes, hagstones.
And the idea there was that you could look through a hagstone, and if you want to see a pixie, that's what you do. You look through it because the hole is supposed to lead you into another realm.
Yes.
That's what I do. But you've got to go on. If it was a nicer day, we'd go on the beach and try and find your way.
Corbin Head, you said.
Don't know what time it is now. We might even do it today.
Yeah.
I'll take you down there. So, so lots of lore on that. We're off at tangents again here. But but hagstones I think are really interesting. Kids love them.
Yeah.
Because it's something, and it's free, isn't it? But you can, the rule is that you can only find it yourself.
Yeah.
I couldn't find one and give it to you because it wouldn't work.
Right.
And the old folklore is that you don't find a hagstone, they find you.
Okay.
So you can only have one. You can't buy one. You can't make one. They've got to find you.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a portal into another world. They're also called witch stones, which is why they're people use them as talismans for about 1,000 years, we reckon. No, about 5,000 years possibly. So because they're so unusual, the idea is that evil can't pass through the hole; it gets trapped. Right. So if you look at old Devon houses, they still use them as door knockers on a bit of rope.
Yeah.
And that's or they hang them in byres because witches used to come in and
Yes.
Attack animals and things, and there's something called a hag riding. So a witch would come in and steal a horse, ride it all night, and then bring it back exhausted.
This is interesting because there's a whole overlap between what the pixies did and the witches did. And they're kind of interchangeable, aren't they?
They're interchangeable, and I think that was, let's see, and we've got a benign view of pixies now as being, fun and Disney-fied and things. Yeah. But they were seen as malevolent, the pixie-led, and they would swap your children and things like that. Yeah. So how much of that is sort of, the sort of Christian church jumping on old pagan traditions? I think that's probably something to do with it. Let's blacken the name of anything that we haven't actually got control of. Yeah. And people really believed in pixies, right up certainly to the 20th century. That really, it was a common belief that pixies were out there. Yes. And it was a common belief all over Devon. And gradually, as we get more rational and rationalised, we pushed them out of we Disneyfied them, and turned them into something that they never actually were. But there was real fear.
Yes. And there are lots of accounts of people. Well, it's what we would call poltergeist activity now,
Yeah.
isn't it? That mixture of things being thrown,
Yeah.
or noises, strange noises.
All of that, yes.
All
Another
of
one, I do a lot of work in health and social care. One of the old beliefs was that pixies would come into your home and steal a newborn baby and replace it with another, a changeling.
Yeah.
And one of the suggestions is that gave people an excuse when they had a disabled child. You know, that it wasn't really your child anyway, so if it died, it's... And there's this whole thing about, in the 19th century, 18th, 19th, 20th century, about baby farmers killing children.
Oh,
you know, and we've got a case of Charlotte Windsor locally, changed the law, that's, you know, for desperately poor women or single parents that couldn't afford to keep their children, they'd give them to a baby farm and they'd be murdered.
Oh.
So, I mean, this is...
what they did?
Oh, massively.
Gosh.
So, I mean, those are the real British serial killers. They killed hundreds. I mean, there's...
my God, that's
it's depressing.
shocking.
Depressing, but that's what he did, and we had a real case in Torquay, but every... and then you can't get into the whole realm of cunning men and cunning women, which is really interesting, about white witches. You know, every local community, before the NHS, you know, had a cunning man or a cunning woman that you'd go to with your minor ailments. They give you talismans or read out of magic books. There's the White Witch of Newton Abbot.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, in the 1850s, very popular with women, apparently.
Where did she live?
It was a he.
Oh, he?
It's a man, John Collender, I think it's called. But they all had them, and they... so every community had them. So, you know, where do you go if you've got, you know, a particular illness? Where do you go if you think that somebody's cursing you? Or you fall out with somebody? So you need a protection. And who'd sell you the magic charms? Who'd make them? Who'd give them the potions? And it was these... So every little community had them. And they were going right up. And in fact... Some of them are still going. Do you remember, I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, you could still have the old lady in the village that could cure warts.
I've heard of that. I don't remember that.
Yeah, I vaguely remember it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they do little poultices and things. And that's the remnant of the cunning man and woman. We've got lots of incidents in Devon. I think it was Ashburton. There was somebody was stealing books from the local church. So they called in a cunning woman. So it just shows how the Christian church actually used these local practitioners to identify the culprit. So we've got loads and loads of incidents. But the challenge has always been which are real practitioners, and which are real white witches, or whatever you want to call them, and which are the con artists.
Yes.
And there was one guy in Teignmouth who, when photography came out, first... if you sent him money, he would send you a photograph of the person you were going to marry.
Really?
Except he was sending the same photograph to everybody, and he went to prison, I think. And there's all of this. You know, how do you differentiate between a real palm reader or a real psychic and somebody that's, you know, a con artist? It's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, well, I was going to say it's easier nowadays, but it's not really, because even though you might be able to speak to somebody a bit quicker about, so-and-so, you know, and checking them out. There's so much now with AI that people can do.
It's gonna happen even more, and conspiracy theories and things like that.
Yeah,
so.
all of that.
Yes, it all round and round
in a circle.
Yeah.
And there's some haunted bridges and roads around Torquay as well.
Very much so. It's back to the liminal idea.
Yeah.
A gap between there's a fascinating bridge. There's a little bridge just outside of Newton Abbot, on the way to Trago. It was called the Devil's Bridge.
Yeah.
And apparently the devil used to hide under that bridge.
Oh.
But a lot of bridges have got sort of devils. But it's again it's one from one thing to another. So there's a gap. So what lives in the gap? It's not controlled by that church or that church. That's where the devil lives. And and also that's where we used to execute people and bury people. So if you look at, every community used to have a gallows.
Yes.
Outside of Newton Abbot, it's Forcher's Cross.
Oh, yeah.
On the way to Trago.
Yeah.
Forcher's means gallows.
Right.
So we used to execute people, and that's at the crossroads there. So the idea is that you didn't want, if you executed somebody, they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Yeah. So you didn't want them in your parish. They didn't want them in their parish, so you buried them at the at the crossroads, and so it didn't have a Christian burial, so you buried them and you put a stake through them, which is where the whole Dracula thing links up with. Put a stake through them so they wouldn't rise at night, and if they got to the crossroads, they wouldn't know which way to go. The devil always lives at crossroads, where they get the jazz thing from. So I mean, Gallows Gate on the outside of Torquay, we think thousands of people would have lost their lives up there. In pretty terrible circumstances, but we also know that right up to the 1960s, people used to avoid those areas at night, even though they couldn't remember why. The legend was that that's not a safe place to be, because that's where all those people were buried, and there's some kind of a memory that don't you go up there. And we also know that the gallows were really sacred to people, so.
Yeah. Do you know anything about any hauntings around Fludyer Hill?
Not that I not particularly
Barton.
know. Barton. Oh, I mean, Barton's got there's loads of stuff at Barton. Barton. The holiday camp. Yeah, there's a white lady ghost up there. The other thing you got, and the other big thing about Barton and a lot of other rural areas, is that a lot of the ghost stories and legends that came up in about the 1790s to the 1820s.
Right.
Which is precisely the time we got smuggling.
Yes.
So, because we've been smuggling in Torbay for like 1,000 years. They've been pulling in stuff 500 years because things, as soon as you get taxation, if things are more expensive in one place than the other place, you're going to get people bringing them in. So we know that we were bringing in goods and avoiding taxation. For a long time, and it wasn't too much of a problem. But from about 1790s onwards, the Royal Navy gained control of the Channel, and the revenue men started jumping down on the smugglers. So instead of them bringing them in quite openly on Paynton Beach and through Brixham, they started having to use go around the corner and these little coves.
Yes.
And one of the coves that we do know they used was the ones near Barton. So they'd come in at your sort of maiden combs and bring all the goods in, and there's a lots of stories about odd things being seen at night. There's a story in Paynton about the smugglers painting their horses like skeletons.
Oh, is that?
Yeah, it's fun over there. And there's lots of things that stories like, and Daddy Hole playing Devil's Hole, the devil lived up there. Another place we knew smuggled goods came in.
Yeah.
Barton, certainly, there's a big tree there. And lots of houses had little, hidden areas where the brandy and the tea would come in, and you'd hide them. So the idea is that the smugglers made up these stories. First of all, to keep people indoors at night, and second, if you see any odd lights, it's not smugglers, it's ghosts. Or you can explain that to the revenue men. Oh, I don't go out at night because of the ghosts. So, but the Fludyer Hill stuff. Anything particularly you've heard there, or is it just general?
My dad's had some strange experiences. I recorded a chat with him a couple of months ago, and he and a friend were driving down Fludyer Hill a few months ago one night, and just somebody came out of the hedge on the one side and crossed in front of them.
Oh, right.
But they couldn't. They stopped the car to have a look. They couldn't see anyone. Yeah, just
there's lots and lots of these in those kind of those snippets, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you hear them and you think, well, it could mean anything, or but it hasn't got a backstory.
Well, they went to the pub. I forgot which pub it was. Maybe it was the pub in Kingscow as well.
Yeah.
The one on the bridge. And,
yes. Yeah,
and they said, oh yeah, we've heard.
Nelson or something. Yeah.
Yeah, we've heard.
Yeah.
That story.
Lots of Iron Age stuff there. There are things on that road. Old Coach Road, of course. So yeah, certainly. I mean, people see things. Again, more than one witness, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? That's first rule.
Yeah.
More than one witness. Did you see something which is peculiar?
Yeah. Interesting area.
That's it. I'm just trying to think of other things around here. So there's a pet cemetery around the corner here. Have you ever been there?
No. Oh gosh.
I've got to be back by one, but let's have a. I'll see the pet cemetery. That's another thing. That's an interesting, opening into the big debates in the 19th century about death and the real rigid rules, because they were absolutely fixated on, and people would go into huge debt, and the death industry was really competitive, and You know, we've moved away from death, really. You know, because we hopefully will live to our 80s and 90s.
Yes.
But when, you know, the average life expectancy could be 27 or something for most of human history, and you know, women dying in childbirth, and you know, that whole ritual around, and I find cemeteries and graveyards fascinating about how we changed, you know, our views of death. Because we've got the old memento mori up in the local churchyard of the skull and crossbones, and how that changed in about 20, 30 years from being, you know, you're going to die, you know, we're going to get you, really. You're going to go to hell unless you behave, right up to the cherubs and in heaven. So instead of focus on hell, focus on heaven. And then it became competitive, and you built these enormous garden cemeteries, you know, full of, and they became parks. People used to go there, you know, for days out. You know, forget the beach. Take your carriage up and go and sit around Granny's grave. You know, it's depressing stuff. But they were fascinated by this whole ritual about, you know, women not having to wear black for 12 months, and you know, and men having different sized hats and things. So
just heard something tapping.
Was it your thing? You can always do this again.
Strange. Yeah. No, it's great.
This place is full of them, of course.
Just wondering what else. Yeah, speaking about bridges and no man's land. So how far is the graveyard, the pet cemetery?
Well, we'd be there in 5 minutes. I'll go show you if you like.
Yeah, shall we go and have a look? Yeah.
So these are all pet cemetery.
Oh, whose pets are they?
The Carey family. They were all. So it just, one of the big debates is what heaven was going to be like in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, Robin. So there's another half dozen of those which they've had to store because they're being vandalised and damaged. But one of the big debates is if people die and go to heaven, what's heaven like?
Yeah.
Do animals have souls?
Yes.
Do pets go to heaven?
Yeah.
So this is what you've got here. Now, originally these, and if you look at these kind of gravestones, they would have a little body, because on some of these I think it says at eternal rest or at sleep.
Yeah.
Because you go to sleep and you wake up. So these were designed like beds. So there's your bed head, and then you'd have the thing through here. So you've got another one of these at Cockington. These are only obviously the rich families.
Yeah.
But the debate was, if you die and you go to heaven, are you going to sort of meet up with not just your family and friends, really, not just in spirit, but do you get, which is one of the reasons why they had this real ban on cremation until the beginning of the 20th century. Because if you destroyed the human body, so it was only sort of quite radical tradition that people were cremated. So the whole idea is that you'd bodily, in the Christian tradition, you'd bodily come back. You come out of your grave and you see the old medieval pictures about the bodies, you know, crawling out with skeletons and then getting their flesh back on. But if you were burned, what can you do it? But then the Eastern tradition started coming in about cremations, and they had to change the law, and now most people are cremated rather than buried. So.
Thanks for your time today.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Where can people connect with you and find your books?
Okay, I've written a book called Talking of Social History, and there's a couple of chapters in there about the kind of stuff that we're talking about, with legends, and there's another on the sort of supernatural side. So it's just Google it on the internet, or whatever they call it these days, or you can get it from Artisan Gallery on Fleet Street in Torquay. So that goes down quite. And otherwise, I do lots of walks and talks, and I often go around and visit different sort of community groups and things like that. And everybody likes local history. That's real history. Yeah. It's not kings and queens. It's walking down your high street and spotting something you like and saying, where did that come from and who used to live there. And two of the most popular talks I do, three I do. I do one called an Unnatural History of Torquay's Ghosts. It goes down really well. Yeah. I do one on pubs and clubs of Torquay, because people remember, that's their childhood, and one on legends of South Devon, and things like that, and movies of Torbay and things like that. So it's all local stuff, and I love going into a room, and you've got 40, 50 people there, and they think, oh, what's he going to talk about? Is it going to be boring? And then you can just see people get excited and say, I understand that. I was there. I did it, and I've heard this, and
brilliant.
I love it.
I'd love to come to one of your talks. So where do you advertise your talks?
Usually just all over the internet. I used to put them in the sort of local newspapers, more websites. If anybody Googles Kevin Dixon Torquay, it'll probably crop up with something I'm advertised and things like that, and I enjoy it.
Fabulous.
Really love it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure. But they were fascinated by this whole ritual about, women not having to wear black for 12 months and, after men having different sized hats.
Just heard something tapping.
Was it your thing? You always do this again.
Strange. Yeah. No, it's great.
This place is full of them, of course.